time didn't erase what happened. It simply taught everyone how to live around it. From the outside, their life had become something people admired again. Not loudly, not publicly, but quietly. The kind of life that didn't invite attention. They had built it that way on purpose. A home that felt removed from noise, a routine that didn't leave much room for chaos, a relationship that had grown not from intensity, but from consistency. Years had passed since the day everything changed, and in those years, something important had happened. Nothing. No sudden returns, no unfinished confrontations, no shadows from the past reaching forward. That absence had slowly turned into comfort. At first, they were careful, aware that what they had begun came from something broken, that their happiness had started in the middle of someone else's ending. But over time, that awareness faded, not because it didn't matter, but because life kept moving. And when life moves long enough without interruption, people begin to believe something dangerous, that it will keep doing so. The message arrived on an ordinary evening. There was nothing special about the moment. No storm outside, no tension in the air, no warning. Just a quiet space, soft light, a routine that had repeated itself enough times to feel permanent. He noticed it first, not because it stood out, but because it didn't. An unfamiliar notification, a name that didn't trigger memory, a message that contained almost nothing, just a single line, not threatening, not emotional, not even clear, but something about it lingered. Most people would have ignored it, deleted it, moved on without a second thought. He didn't, not because he understood it, but because something deep and instinctive told him it didn't belong. He read it again and again, looking for meaning that wasn't obvious. He didn't mention it, not yet, because bringing attention to something uncertain gives it weight, makes it real before it needs to be. So he let it sit, but something small had already shifted. She noticed it, not the message itself, but the change. It was subtle, almost invisible, a pause that lasted slightly longer than usual, a distraction that didn't fit the moment, a thought that didn't fully leave. She had always been good at noticing things like that, even now, even after years of stability, especially now, because when life becomes predictable, even the smallest disruption stands out. She didn't ask, didn't push, because she had learned something important, that some things reveal themselves more clearly when left alone, but she didn't forget it either. Days passed. Nothing happened, no follow-up, no explanation, no visible consequence, and slowly it began to feel insignificant, like something that had almost mattered, but didn't, until it happened again. This time, the message came at a different hour, still quiet, still minimal, still wrong, not in content, but in presence, because now it wasn't a coincidence. Now it was a pattern. And patterns mean intention. He felt it this time, not confusion, not curiosity, awareness, the kind that sharpens your senses, makes you notice things you would normally overlook. He didn't delete the message, didn't respond, but he also didn't ignore it anymore, because something about it felt deliberate, not rushed, not desperate, controlled. And control always comes from someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Across the room, she watched him. Not directly, not obviously, but enough. Enough to see that whatever this was, it hadn't gone away, and neither had the feeling that came with it. That night felt different. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The silence in their home, once comforting, now carried something unfamiliar. Not fear, not yet, but anticipation. The kind that doesn't come from excitement, but from instinct. Far away from them, someone else was watching. Not physically, not directly, but closely. because everything happening now was exactly how it was supposed to begin. Not with confrontation, not with presence, but with doubt. Doubt that slips in quietly, builds slowly, spreads without resistance. Because the strongest structures don't break from the outside, they weaken from within. She had waited years for this moment, not because she needed time to heal, but because she needed time to understand, to study, to learn, to prepare, and most importantly, to become patient enough not to rush, because revenge, when done too quickly, loses its shape, but when done slowly, it becomes something else entirely. She had watched their life from a distance, not constantly, not obsessively, but enough. Enough to know their patterns, their routines, their habits, enough to understand where stability existed and where it could be broken. The messages were never meant to scare them. That would have been too obvious, too easy. They were meant to do something far more effective, to be ignored. At first, then noticed, then questioned. Because once something is questioned, it never fully returns to what it was before. Back in their home, the second message didn't lead to panic. It led to something quieter, a conversation that wasn't spoken, a shared awareness that something was off. And for the first time in years, the past didn't feel as far away as it once had. He looked at the message one more time before locking his phone, and this time the feeling wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Not of the sender, not of the words, but of the intent. Something had returned, not loudly, not visibly, but deliberately, and whatever it wasn't finished. Far away, she finally allowed herself to take the next step, not out of anger, not out of emotion, but out of precision, because the first crack had formed, and now it was time to make it spread. The first crack didn't break anything. Not immediately. It sat there, small, almost invisible. But once something fractures, even slightly, it changes how everything around it holds together. And that's how it began. Not with fear, not with chaos, but with awareness. They didn't talk about the messages directly, not at first, because saying something out loud gives it form, makes it real in a way that can't be undone. So instead, they adjusted, subtly. He checked his phone more often than he used to, not obviously, not enough for anyone else to notice, but she did, because she always noticed. It wasn't suspicion, not yet. It was instinct, the same instinct that had once told her she was losing him long before anything had been said. That instinct had been quiet for years. Now it was back. The third message arrived at a time that didn't make sense. Not late, not early, just precise, as if it had been sent not based on convenience, but on observation. That was the first time it felt intentional in a way he couldn't ignore. The message itself was still minimal, still controlled, but this time it carried something new, a reference, not obvious, not direct, but enough. Enough to suggest that whoever was sending them knew something, something small, something specific, something they shouldn't. He read it twice, then a third time. The meaning didn't fully reveal itself, but the implication did. This wasn't random, and more importantly, this wasn't distant. That night, the silence between them changed. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't the same either, because now there was something unspoken sitting between them, not yet acknowledged, but present. She felt it clearly now, not just in him, but in herself. A tension that didn't belong to the moment, a thought that didn't fully form but refused to leave. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider something she had avoided completely. The past wasn't gone. She didn't jump to conclusions, didn't let her mind spiral into assumptions, because she wasn't that person anymore. But she also didn't dismiss the feeling, because she had learned the cost of ignoring instinct. The fourth message came sooner, not by much, but enough to break the pattern of distance. And this time, it didn't try to stay vague. It shifted, just slightly, from observation to intrusion. It referenced a place, not directly, not by name, but in a way that made it unmistakable. Their place. That was the moment everything changed. Not dramatically, not outwardly, but internally, completely. He didn't question it anymore, because now there was nothing to question. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't harmless. This was deliberate. And more than that, it was close. He showed her the message, not with urgency, not with panic, but with a quiet seriousness that said everything he hadn't been saying before. She read it once, and in that single moment, everything she had been holding back aligned into something clear. Not fully understood, but recognized. The feeling she had ignored days ago now had shape. Not a full answer, but a direction. She didn't react emotionally, didn't let fear take over, because something in her understood that this wasn't meant to scare them. Not yet. This was something else, a beginning. She looked at him, not with doubt, but with awareness, because whatever this was, it wasn't just about him, it was about them. And suddenly, the life they had built together didn't feel as isolated as it once had. They didn't call anyone, didn't report it, didn't try to involve the outside world, because something about the situation felt controlled, like reacting too quickly would mean stepping into something unprepared, so they did something else. They watched. Days passed again, but this time the waiting felt different. Not calm, not passive, alert. Every sound felt slightly sharper, every routine slightly more noticeable, not because anything had visibly changed, but because now they were looking. And when you start looking, you begin to see things you missed before. A car that lingered slightly too long, a shadow that didn't belong to anything obvious, a moment where something felt off, even without proof. None of it was enough to confirm anything, but together it built something quiet, something growing. Far away, she watched it happen exactly as she had planned. The shift, the awareness, the slow unraveling of certainty. She didn't rush, didn't escalate too quickly, because she understood something most people didn't. Fear is strongest when it builds gradually, not when it's forced. The messages had done their job. Now it was time to deepen the pattern. The next message didn't come for several days, long enough for tension to stretch, for anticipation to settle into something heavier. And when it arrived, it was different. Not in length, not in tone, but in impact. Because this time, it didn't reference something general, it referenced a moment, a real one, a specific one, something that had happened recently, something private, something that only two people should have known. That was the moment the air changed completely. He felt it first, a sharp, unmistakable realization that cut through everything else. This wasn't observation from a distance, this was proximity. And suddenly, the question wasn't, what is happening? It was, who is close enough to see this? She felt it too, not as a thought, but as something deeper, something instinctive, because there are very few people who can cross that kind of boundary, very few who would. And in that moment, a name surfaced, not spoken, not confirmed, but undeniable. The past hadn't just returned, it had been watching them long before they realized it. Neither of them said it out loud, because saying it would make it real in a way they weren't ready for. But the silence between them now held something new, not just tension, not just uncertainty, recognition. Far away, she finally allowed herself to take satisfaction in something small. Not the fear, not the confusion, but the timing, because everything was unfolding exactly as it should. They were beginning to understand, but they still didn't know enough, and that was the most important part, because knowing just enough to feel threatened, but not enough to act, that's where control truly exists. The next step wouldn't be louder, it wouldn't be obvious, it would be closer, and when it came, there would be no room left for doubt. Back in their home, the silence had changed completely now. It was no longer peaceful. It was waiting, and both of them knew whatever was coming next wouldn't stay hidden. Fear doesn't always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as certainty. Not the kind that reassures you, the kind that settles in your chest and tells you something is already too close. By the time they reached that point, the messages had stopped feeling like interruptions. They had become part of the atmosphere. Not constant, not overwhelming, but present enough that nothing felt untouched anymore. Their home, once quiet, steady, predictable, had changed. Not physically. Nothing visible had shifted, but the way they existed inside it had. Every movement carried awareness now. Every silence had weight, and most importantly, every moment felt like it could be seen. They didn't say her name, not yet, but the thought existed, unspoken, unavoidable, because there were only so many people who knew enough, only so many who would have the patience, the control, the reason, and only one who had both the motive and the discipline to wait. He tried to approach it logically, tried to reduce it to possibilities, to explanations that didn't lead where his instincts were already pointing. Because if he allowed himself to accept that it was her, then everything changed. Not just the situation, but what it meant. It meant this wasn't random, it wasn't impulsive, it was planned. And planning takes time, which meant she hadn't moved on. She didn't need logic, she didn't need proof, because deep down she already knew, not from evidence, but from understanding. People don't change that completely, not when something is left unfinished, and what had happened years ago had never been resolved. It had simply stopped, and things that stop without ending have a way of returning. The first real shift didn't come from a message. It came from something far more subtle, something that couldn't be ignored. It happened in a place that had always felt neutral, public, open, safe by design, a routine stop, a familiar environment, the kind of place where nothing unexpected should happen. He noticed it first. Not clearly, not immediately, just a feeling. The kind that makes you look up without knowing why, the kind that tells you something is out of place before you understand what it is. At first, there was nothing obvious. People moving normally, voices blending into background noise, everything exactly as it should be. But the feeling didn't leave. It stayed. And when something stays like that, there's always a reason. He shifted his focus, not directly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to observe. And then, for a fraction of a moment, something aligned. A figure, not close, not approaching, but present, still, watching. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but to him, it stood out immediately, because stillness in a moving space always does. He didn't react, didn't stare, didn't confirm what he thought he saw, because something told him that acknowledgement was exactly what this moment was waiting for. Instead, he looked away, but not before something settled in his chest. Recognition. Not visual, not certain, but enough. Across from him, she felt it too. Not the figure, not directly, but him. the shift in his awareness, the way his attention had sharpened without explanation. And that was enough, because by now they didn't need everything to be visible. They understood each other in smaller ways, subtle ways, ways that didn't require confirmation. They left sooner than planned, not rushed, not obvious, but deliberate, because something had crossed a line. Something had moved from distance to presence. Back in their space, the silence was no longer passive. It was active, heavy, because now the question wasn't if, it was how close. He replayed the moment in his mind over and over, trying to reconstruct what he had seen, what he had felt. But it didn't become clearer, only sharper, because instinct doesn't need detail to be right. She didn't ask what he saw, because she already understood what it meant. The line had been crossed, and once that happens, there's no going back to distance. Far away, she had already moved on to the next step, not physically, not yet, but strategically, because this moment had been necessary, not to confront, not to reveal, but to confirm. She had needed to see something, not them, but their reaction, their awareness, their connection, their ability to sense what wasn't being shown. And now she had her answer. They were stronger than before, more aware, more aligned, which meant breaking them wouldn't be simple. But that didn't concern her, because she had never relied on simplicity, only precision. The next message came that night, short, controlled, but different, because this time it didn't hint, it didn't suggest, it acknowledged, not directly, not openly, but enough to say, I was there. That was the moment everything changed completely. He didn't question it anymore, didn't look for alternative explanations, because now there weren't any. She read the message once, and for the first time since this began, she felt something shift inside her. Not fear, but something colder, understanding. This wasn't just someone watching. This was someone entering their world, and that meant the distance was gone, completely. The silence between them no longer held questions. It held certainty, and certainty is dangerous, because once you know something is real, you can't pretend it isn't happening. Far away, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, not satisfaction, not yet, because this was only the beginning of something much larger. The first step had been doubt, the second had been awareness, this was proximity, and the next step wouldn't be quiet. Once something steps into your life, it doesn't stay at the edges. It moves inward, quietly, deliberately. And by the time you realize how close it is, it's already part of everything. After that night, the messages stopped feeling like signals from a distance. They became something else, a presence. Not constant, not overwhelming, but precise, appearing only when they mattered most. The silence between each message stretched longer now, not because it was over, but because it was evolving, because whoever was behind it understood something crucial, that fear doesn't grow from frequency, it grows from timing, and the timing was perfect. Their routines didn't change drastically. That would have meant reacting, admitting something had control over them. Instead, they adjusted in ways that looked normal, more awareness, more attention, but no visible disruption. From the outside, their life still looked untouched, but inside it, something had shifted completely. Trust, once effortless, now carried weight. Not because they doubted each other, but because something else had entered the space between them, something unseen, something intentional. The next move didn't come through a message, it came through something far more dangerous, information. It started small, something misplaced, not lost, not stolen, just moved. An object that should have been in one place, found in another. It wasn't enough to alarm anyone at first, because things get misplaced, people forget, memory isn't perfect. But then it happened again, and again. Each time slightly more noticeable, slightly harder to explain, until it stopped feeling like coincidence. He noticed the pattern first, not the objects themselves, but the feeling attached to them, the same feeling the messages had carried, controlled, measured, intentional. He didn't say it immediately, because saying it meant accepting something far more invasive than messages. It meant someone wasn't just watching anymore. Someone had been inside their space. That realization didn't create panic, it created stillness, because panic is loud, reactive, and this situation didn't allow for loudness. This required something else, something sharper. She understood it before he said anything, because the moment she saw the third shift, the third inconsistency that couldn't be explained, the truth settled in. This wasn't about fear anymore. This was about control. Someone was testing boundaries, not breaking them completely, just enough to see how far they could go without being stopped. And that meant one thing: the real move hadn't happened yet. Far away, she watched the pattern unfold exactly as she had designed it. The placement, the timing, the subtlety. Every detail mattered, because this wasn't about causing chaos. It was about creating doubt. Doubt in memory, doubt in awareness, and eventually, doubt in each other. Because no matter how strong two people are, if you distort their reality slowly enough, they begin to question what's real. And once that happens, you don't need to break them. They begin to break themselves. The next step came carefully, not too soon, not too obvious. A message, but different this time. Not minimal, not vague, personal. It didn't just reference something they knew, it referenced something they had felt. A private moment, one that had never been shared, never spoken. Something soft, something quiet, something that belonged only to them. That was the moment the air changed completely. Because this wasn't observation anymore. This was intrusion into something deeper than space, into connection. He felt it like a fracture, not in the situation, but in certainty, because there was no logical way for someone to know that, no explanation that made sense, which left only one possibility. They had been closer than they thought, much closer. She felt something else, not fear, violation, not physical, not visible, but real, because something that had always been theirs, untouched, private, was no longer protected, and that changed everything. The silence between them shifted again, not into distance, but into tension, not directed at each other, but existing between them. Because now the question wasn't just what is happening, it was how much has already happened without us knowing. That question doesn't create immediate answers, it creates hesitation, and hesitation is where fractures grow. Far away, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, not because they were afraid, but because they were uncertain. And uncertainty was always the goal, because fear can be resisted, but doubt reshapes everything. The next step would be different, not quieter, not subtle, because the foundation had already been weakened. Now it was time to apply pressure. Back in their world, the stillness didn't feel safe anymore. It felt watched, and both of them knew whatever came next wouldn't stay hidden. By the time the final shift came, it didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable, like something that had been building quietly for too long had finally reached the point where it couldn't remain unseen anymore. The air in their life had already changed, not violently, not loudly, but completely. There was no longer a sense of normal, no clear boundary between what was safe and what wasn't. Everything felt observed, measured, and worst of all, uncertain. They had stopped trying to explain it logically because logic required limits, boundaries, and whatever this was didn't seem to follow any. Instead, they adapted. They moved more carefully, paid attention to details they would have once ignored. But even that began to feel insufficient because awareness only protects you when you know what you're looking for, and they didn't, not fully. The final message didn't arrive when they expected it because by then they were expecting something. And expectation can be predicted, planned around, used. So it came in a moment that felt ordinary. A moment that didn't carry tension, didn't feel watched, a moment where for a brief second they had almost forgotten. That's when it appeared, not as a notification, not as a message waiting to be opened, but already there, on the screen, waiting. That was the first thing that felt different, not sent, not received, placed. He didn't react immediately, not because he wasn't alarmed, but because something about it demanded stillness. The message was longer this time, not excessive, but complete. No vagueness, no suggestion, only clarity. It didn't threaten, didn't accuse, it stated. And what it stated didn't need explanation because it confirmed everything they had already begun to understand, that nothing they had experienced over the past weeks had been random, that every message, every shift, every moment of doubt had been intentional, designed, and most importantly, directed at them, together. That was the part that mattered most, because this had never been about him alone or her alone. It had always been about what they had become, something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that had disrupted a path that had already been decided, and now that imbalance was being corrected. She felt it settle in her chest before she fully processed it. Not fear, not shock, recognition. Because deep down, she had known this was where it was leading. The past doesn't return quietly unless it intends to be heard. And now it was speaking clearly. He looked at her, not for answers, but for alignment. Because whatever happened next, they would face it together. That much hadn't changed, but something else had. Because this time, they weren't reacting. They were ready, or at least they believed they were. That belief didn't last long because the next step didn't come through a message. It came through presence, real, unavoidable. They didn't see her arrive. They felt it, the same way they had felt everything else, a shift in the air, a stillness that didn't belong. And when they turned, she was already there. Not hidden, not distant, standing in the same space they had believed was still theirs. Time didn't seem to move in that moment because reality had finally caught up with everything that had been building. She hadn't changed in the ways people would expect. No visible signs of anger, no outward indication of what she had carried all these years. She looked exactly as she always had, composed, controlled. But there was something different now, something beneath the surface. Not emotion, intent. She didn't move closer, didn't rush the moment, because she didn't need to. The distance between them wasn't physical anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. The silence stretched, not empty, full, because everything that needed to be understood already was. This wasn't confrontation. This was completion, the end of something that had been left unfinished and the beginning of something else. She didn't need to speak because everything she had done had already said enough. The messages, the intrusion, the slow unraveling of their certainty, all of it had led to this moment, not to destroy them immediately, but to show them something, that what they had built was never beyond reach, that time hadn't erased anything, it had only delayed it. He stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, not defensively, but with something steady, because despite everything, he didn't step back, and neither did she. The quiet girl who had once stayed in the background now stood without hesitation, not as someone waiting, but as someone who had already chosen her place. That was the moment something shifted again, not in fear, but in balance, because this was no longer one-sided, no longer controlled from a distance. Now, everyone was present, and presence changes everything. For the first time, there was no uncertainty about what this was. Not revenge, not just that, something deeper, something that had been building quietly for years, a need to restore something that had been taken, or perhaps a need to prove that it never truly was. The moment didn't explode. There was no dramatic ending, because some stories don't end with noise. They end with understanding, and this understanding was clear. This wasn't over, not even close, because whatever she had come back for, she hadn't taken it yet, and whatever they believed they had protected would now be tested in ways they couldn't yet see. She turned slightly, not away, but just enough to signal something final, not departure, but continuation, because this wasn't the end of her plan. It was only the moment she stepped into it fully. And as she walked away, not rushed, not hesitant, certain, they understood something that hadn't been fully clear until now. The messages were never the real threat. The waiting was. And now that the waiting was over, everything else could begin. The silence she left behind wasn't empty. It was loaded with everything that was still to come, and as they stood there, together, aware, unshaken but no longer untouched, one truth settled in completely. Some stories don't end when people choose each other. They begin again when someone refuses to let that choice exist.